Brothers and sisters, fellow citizens, sons and daughters of this land, today I stand before you not as a man who has lived without scars, but as one who has walked through fire and emerged tempered by it. My journey has not been a straight path, nor a smooth one. It has been one of shadows and storms, of sleepless nights and restless days, of threats, betrayals, attacks and battles that seemed impossible to win. Yet it is through these trials that destiny carved a role for me, one that I did not choose lightly, but one that became inevitable. As history called upon me and as my country demanded a voice, a defender, a servant, and a leader. From my earliest days in service, I understood that our nation was bleeding. It was not simply poverty, nor merely underdevelopment. It was the weight of 1,000 wounds inflicted by corruption, by external manipulation, by terrorism, and by the internal divisions that left us fractured. Every day I saw families displaced, children abandoned by the security that should have been theirs, and villages left vulnerable to ruthless forces who sought nothing but destruction. I knew then that the path I had chosen would not be an ordinary one. Threats began early. They came not only from enemies outside our borders, but from those within who profited from the suffering of their people. There were whispers of assassination, plots devised in secrecy, enemies who believed that intimidation would silence me. I remember the first time I was told not to return to a certain place because there was a plan to end my life. I went anyway because I believed that fear cannot guide the destiny of a leader. And though the threats grew, though the attacks became more violent, though the danger became ever present, each day I chose to continue, for I knew that if I yielded, the people would yield, and if I surrendered, then the very hope of my nation would collapse with me. There were moments of despair when comrades fell beside me in the battlefield, when soldiers under my command did not return home, when mothers wailed at the loss of their sons, and when the very soil of our land seemed drenched in sorrow. Yet every death, every sacrifice, every tear shed in grief reminded me that surrender was not an option. I carried their memories as a shield, their courage as a sword, and their hopes as the compass that would not allow me to turn away. Our land was not just attacked by weapons, it was attacked by poverty, by injustice, by the deliberate marginalization of our people. Terrorists exploited this, feeding on despair, expanding their influence where the state had abandoned its people. I could not simply stand in the shadows and watch my people crumble under the weight of this crisis. I stepped forward not because I thought myself greater than others, but because the silence of those who could act would have been a betrayal of the generations to come. War tested us all. It was not the kind of war that is fought on a single front, but one that stretched across villages, towns, and even the hearts of men. Sometimes it was fought with weapons, other times with ideas, sometimes with diplomacy, and other times with sheer resilience. We faced an enemy that was not always visible, that hid in shadows, that struck without mercy, yet through it all we refused to bow down. Each battle became a message, not only to those who sought to destroy us, but to the entire world, that a people determined to defend their homeland cannot be broken. But battles were not only waged with bullets, there was another war, a political war, a crisis of legitimacy, a struggle against systems that had long failed the people. Those in power had grown distant from the cries of the poor, promises were made but never kept. Resources were exploited, but never used to heal the wounds of the nation. And as the crisis deepened, the people began to look not toward the politicians who had failed them, but toward the young, the determined, and those who still carried the flame of patriotism in their heart. It was in this crucible of struggle that the idea of leadership fell upon me. I had not dreamt of being president, I had dreamt of serving my people with honor. But destiny is not always shaped by our desires, it is often carved by necessity. The call came not from my own ambition, but from the voices of a nation that demanded change, demanded protection, demanded dignity. When the people cry out, when a nation bleeds, when injustice becomes unbearable, someone must rise. And though I carried doubts, though I knew the risks, I understood that I could not turn away. The road to leadership was not paved with applause, it was paved with suspicion, resistance, betrayal, and countless obstacles. There were those who mocked, those who ridiculed, those who whispered that I was too young, too inexperienced, too bold to lead. There were attempts to discredit me, attempts to weaken the faith of the people, attempts to divide us. I was threatened not just by enemies in battle, but by the politics of power, the greed of elites, and the weight of expectations that seemed impossible to meet. Yet what I held onto was not my own strength, but the strength of the people. I had seen their resilience. I had seen farmers who worked the land despite drought, mothers who raised children despite poverty, soldiers who stood guard despite little reward. I had seen communities that rebuilt after being torn apart, and I knew that if they could stand, then so could I. When the moment finally came, when the struggle carried me to the highest office of this nation, I did not see it as a crown, but as a burden, a sacred duty, a responsibility heavier than any weapon I had ever carried. To lead a nation through crisis is not to bask in power, but to embrace sacrifice. I knew that every decision would be scrutinized, every mistake amplified, every delay condemned. Yet I also knew that leadership is not about avoiding criticism, but about standing firm in the face of it. The challenges did not end with the oath of office. If anything, they multiplied. The enemies grew more desperate, the attacks more violent, the expectations more demanding. But each time I faltered, I remembered why I was there, not for myself but for the generations unborn, for the children who deserve to inherit a land free of fear, for the youth who deserve opportunities, for the elders who deserve dignity. Today I speak not to boast of my journey, but to remind you of what is possible when courage defeats fear, when resilience defeats despair, and when unity defeats division. My story is not the story of a single man. It is the story of a people who refuse to surrender, who refuse to let their destiny be dictated by outsiders, who refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice. It is the story of Burkina Faso itself, scarred but unbroken, wounded but undefeated, challenged but forever rising. And so, I say to you, never doubt the power of sacrifice, never underestimate the strength of unity, and never believe that change is impossible. For I stand before you as living proof that even in the darkest storms, even when all seems lost, even when the world turns its back, a nation that chooses courage will always find its way to the light. This journey has been long, and it is far from over. The struggles continue, the threats remain, the challenges grow, but I promise you this, as long as I breathe, as long as I walk this earth, as long as I hold this responsibility, I will never abandon this nation, I will never betray its people, and I will never surrender its future. Together we will continue the fight, together we will overcome, and together we will build the Burkina Faso that generations have dreamed of, a nation that stands proud, free, united, and strong. The path to leadership was not carved out in moments of peace, but in nights filled with uncertainty and days marked by danger. From the earliest stages of his journey, he was forced to confront the reality that speaking for justice and challenging entrenched systems of power would make him a target. Threats came in whispers and in open declarations. Enemies tried to intimidate him into silence, warning him that his life could be taken at any moment. Yet, he refused to be paralyzed by fear. Several attempts were made to stop him through violence. Assassination plots were whispered in military barracks, meetings were infiltrated by spies, and his movements were tracked in hopes of finding an opportunity to strike. Soldiers loyal to corrupt powers were sent to crush him, while mercenaries tried to undermine his credibility with lies and propaganda. Still he pressed forward, believing that no bullet, no blade, and no betrayal could silence the will of the people he served. His survival was not only the result of physical courage, but also of deep resilience. Every attack against him only made his determination stronger. Each time he escaped an attempt on his life, it reminded him that his mission was bigger than his personal safety. He learned to live with the constant presence of danger, carrying the weight of knowing that every sunrise might bring another confrontation. Yet instead of backing down, he chose to sharpen his vision and stand taller, embodying the spirit of resistance that his people so desperately needed. What made his endurance even more remarkable was that he never allowed hatred to consume him. Though enemies plotted against him, he reminded himself and his followers that their fight was not just against individuals, but against systems of oppression and forces of exploitation. This gave him the clarity to rise above revenge and focus on the greater mission of freedom, justice, and dignity for his people. In surviving threats and attacks, he became more than a man, he became a symbol of defiance. His very existence was proof that courage can outlast fear, that truth can withstand lies, and that even in the face of death one can choose to live for something greater. His survival was not just about protecting his own life, it was about protecting the dream of a nation longing to be free. The battles he faced were not confined to the battlefield alone. His life was a constant struggle across multiple fronts, each demanding strength, strategy, and sacrifice. On one hand, there were armed groups threatening the security of villages, burning schools, displacing families, and spreading fear. On the other, there were invisible enemies, poverty, corruption, and foreign interference that had weakened the nation for decades. To lead in such a climate meant carrying the burden of war in its many forms, both seen and unseen. The military campaigns he oversaw were grueling. Soldiers under his command often had fewer resources than their enemies, yet they fought with unmatched courage. Every victory came at the cost of blood, sweat, and sacrifice. He spent nights on the front lines, not in palaces, choosing to share the risks of his men, rather than hide behind walls of comfort. His presence in the trenches inspired those around him, proving that leadership is not about giving orders from afar, but about standing shoulder to shoulder with those who risk their lives. Beyond the physical wars, he fought political battles that were just as fierce. Corruption had hollowed out institutions, leaving the nation vulnerable to exploitation. He challenged this decay head-on, refusing to bow to elites who had enriched themselves while ordinary people suffered. Each political confrontation carried its own dangers, betrayal, isolation, and attempts to delegitimize his cause. Yet he remained firm, guided by the conviction that justice cannot be negotiated with oppressors. At the same time, he waged a war against despair. Years of instability had made many believe that the nation was destined for collapse. He refused to accept this fatalism. Through his words and actions, he rekindled hope, urging citizens to believe that victory was possible if they stood united. He framed every struggle, whether against armed groups or corruption, as part of a larger war for dignity, independence, and sovereignty. In fighting wars on multiple fronts, he revealed not only his military strength but also his moral resolve. He understood that defeating enemies on the battlefield would mean little if his people remained enslaved by poverty or stripped of their dignity. His war was therefore not only to defend territory but to reclaim the soul of the nation. The path to leadership was born out of crisis, not ambition. The nation had been brought to its knees by years of broken promises, corruption, and betrayal. Leaders who were entrusted with the people's future had abandoned them, choosing to serve foreign interests and personal gain instead of the citizens who placed their trust in them. Towns were left vulnerable to attacks, families displaced by violence, and the youth stripped of opportunity. The air was heavy with despair, and many feared the country was on the verge of collapse. In such a climate, the political system began to crumble. Leaders clung to power, ignoring the suffering that was spreading like wildfire across the land. Protests erupted, voices rose, and the people demanded change, but their cries were met with silence from those in authority. Silence that revealed not only incompetence, but also indifference. It was in this moment of great uncertainty that history demanded a response. He had never sought the throne of power for himself. Yet the crisis gave him no choice. To remain silent would have meant complicity in the destruction of his homeland. To turn away would have been to betray the very people he had sworn to protect. Thus the call to lead came not from ambition, but from necessity, from the urgent demand of a nation that could no longer endure betrayal. His decision to step forward was met with skepticism from elites and resistance from those who feared change. They tried to discredit him, calling him too young, too inexperienced, too bold, but none of their words could drown out the voices of the people, who saw in him a reflection of their own struggle. He embodied their pain, their resilience, and their hope. The political crisis became the crucible that tested his courage. When others wavered, he stood firm. When others negotiated with foreign powers at the expense of sovereignty, he declared that the nation would chart its own course. His rise to leadership was not written in books or decided in parliaments. It was forged in the hearts of ordinary citizens who were ready to fight for their dignity. In answering the call to lead, he became not just a figure of authority, but the living voice of a people refusing to die in silence. His leadership was not a choice. It was destiny written in the cries of a wounded nation. The road to the highest office was anything but smooth. It was not paved with luxury, wealth, or privilege, but with hardship, sacrifice, and unrelenting resistance. Each step forward came after overcoming obstacles designed to break his spirit. Every challenge he faced seemed larger than the last, but instead of deterring him, these trials carved out a leader who would one day stand at the helm of his nation. His journey was marked by sleepless nights, relentless threats, and betrayal by those he once trusted. He saw how ambition corrupted men, how promises of loyalty dissolved in the face of power, and how enemies often wore the masks of friends, yet he endured, because his motivation was never personal gain, it was the survival and dignity of his people. He often stood alone, but even in solitude, he carried the strength of millions who silently looked to him as their last hope. When the moment of transition came, it was not delivered through the peaceful handing over of authority, but through the fire of crisis. The people demanded a leader who could not only speak for them, but fight for them. And so, through sheer resilience, he rose from the struggles of a soldier's life into the responsibility of a president's duty. It was not a position gifted to him, it was seized through struggle, earned through sacrifice, and legitimized by the cries of a people who could no longer endure oppression. As he assumed the mantle of leadership, the weight of the presidency did not blind him to his humble beginnings. He carried with him the memories of those he had lost along the way, the soldiers who fell in battle, the families torn apart by war, and the children forced to grow up amidst violence. Their sacrifices became his compass, reminding him that leadership was not about titles or power, but about service and accountability. The presidency became a continuation of his struggles, not the end of them. He knew that stepping into that role would only attract more enemies, more challenges, and more tests of character. Yet he embraced it, understanding that true leadership is not measured by comfort, but by the willingness to suffer for the greater good. His rise from struggles to the presidency was not only the story of one man, it was the story of an entire nation, reclaiming its destiny. From the very beginning of his leadership, he understood that a nation torn apart by division and fear could never rise to its true potential. Years of conflict had left scars that ran deep between regions, ethnic groups, and even generations. Foreign powers exploited these fractures, feeding division to maintain control. But he saw beyond these divides and believed in a greater truth. Only unity could rebuild a wounded nation, and only resilience could sustain its future. His vision was not one of empty promises or short-term victories. He spoke of a country where differences would no longer be weapons of division but sources of strength. He urged his people to remember that they were bound by more than bloodlines or geography. They were connected by shared struggle, shared sacrifice, and a shared dream of sovereignty. He insisted that unity was not just a political slogan, but the foundation of survival. Without it, no army could win battles, no government could endure, and no society could prosper. Resilience, too, was central to his vision. He reminded his citizens that their history was not defined by defeat, but by endurance. Time and again, they had faced hunger, violence, and betrayal, yet they had survived. That survival, he declared, was proof of their strength. He challenged his people to transform that resilience into determination, not simply to endure suffering but to rise above it, to reclaim dignity, and to build a nation capable of standing proudly on its own. Through his speeches, he ignited a sense of purpose among the youth, who had once felt abandoned. He called on them to see themselves not as victims of a broken system, but as architects of a new dawn. To the elders, he offered respect and reassurance, reminding them that their wisdom was vital to rebuilding. To the soldiers, he offered solidarity, sharing in their sacrifices and losses. In doing so, he bridged the gaps between generations, classes, and communities. His vision of unity and resilience was not naive. It acknowledged the hardships still to come, but it gave the nation a compass to move forward. He planted the belief that no matter the strength of enemies or the weight of challenges, a united and resilient people could never be defeated. That belief became the heartbeat of a nation determined to reclaim its destiny.